Outdoor adventure won't wait for engine problems. Things like hard starts, rough performance, and lost fuel economy are often caused by fuel gum and varnish buildup. Seafoam can help your engine run better and last longer. Simply pour a can in your gas tank. Hunters and anglers rely on Seafoam to keep their engines running the way it should the entire season. Pick up a can of Seafoam today at your local auto parts store or visit seafoamworks.com to learn more.
There's nothing like snook hook sets at dawn or catching a tarpon in the moonlight. Find your next fishing trip made easy on fishingbooker.com and experience the magic of the Sunshine State or any other destination on your fishing bucket list. Book a blue water adventure in search of sailfish or go snapper fishing with the kids. With over 6,000 captains and trips to choose from, planning your next one just got a whole lot easier. Download the Fishing Booker app on the Google Play or App Store or visit them online at fishingbooker.com to book your trip today.
Welcome back to Cutting the Distance. When it comes to managing land and setting it up for whitetail hunting, there seems to be hundreds, if not thousands, of guys to choose from nowadays. But shouldn't a proven hunting track record be the most important thing that you consider before choosing a land consultant, somebody that knows how to set it up for hunting? Well, Don Higgins may be the best doing it currently, and some may say the best to ever do it. Killing mature bucks year after year with a few 200-inch deer sprinkled in the mix, his track record speaks for itself. And that's one of the things I like, about Don, at least from my perspective. He seems to be a humble man that has allowed his track record to do the speaking and not necessarily his own mouth. Don has quite the resume when it comes to educating whitetail hunters. He is the host of the Chasing Giants podcast. He is the author of 2 books, Hunting Trophy Whitetails in the Real World and Real World Whitetail Icons. He's the owner of Real World Wildlife Products that stems from his agricultural background. In addition to all of this, Don continues to speak at seminars around the country, and then in all of his free time, he still runs a whitetail consulting service that continues to grow in demand with each and every passing year. With no further ado, welcome to the show, Don.
Well, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, how's your season been?
Oh, it's been, I don't even know what the word I'd want to use is. Probably different. It's been different than any season that I've ever experienced, and that's saying something after 46 years of deer hunting. But no, I've had some really nice bucks in range. I've passed 3 bucks that are really good. One of them would have scored over 180 inches, and got all that on video. But I like to build the story with these bucks and let them get mature. And when I say mature, I'm talking 6 years old. I know a lot of guys are calling them mature at 4, but so my season's been good. I haven't shot anything, but I've seen a lot of really nice bucks that have the potential to be super in another year or 2.
Yeah, good. Do you have any time left in the stand, or are things starting to wind down with the tags that you have?
Well, I hope I still have some time. The thing of it is, my consulting business just gets so busy starting about December 1st through the rest of the entire winter into spring until it greens up that it doesn't leave me a whole lot of time, but I'm hoping around the holidays and such that I can find some time to get back in the tree.
Perfect. Can you give the audience a quick rundown for people that don't know who you are on, where you started and kind of the quick timeline to where you're at now?
Well, I actually started as a freelance outdoor writer back in 1996. North American Whitetail published my first article. And in the years since, I've had literally hundreds of articles published in just about every major hunting magazine. That led to me writing a book. And also, a lot of the readers of those magazine articles, I think they recognized me as speaking from experience instead of just repeating and regurgitating things I'd heard. And, I did things a little different. I keep things simple, but they work. And I think the readers recognize that. And I started getting calls from people asking me to look at their properties and help them with their hunting success. And so that led to my consulting business. And And then along the way, the whole land management thing kind of exploded. I think it probably started about 15, 20 years ago. And, with my ag background, I started a food plot seed company. We're getting ready to start our 15th year in business next year, but it's a company that's just done fantastic and continues to grow as it has every year for 15 years. But so you can see that I've got my hand in a lot of different pots, but they've all got to do with whitetails and whitetail land management. And it all started, back with those first magazine articles 26 years ago.
Nice. Yeah, you touch on something there about it's fairly simple, and we talked a little bit before and out west on the elk education and elk hunting education. You almost feel guilty when you try to break down what you really do, and it we add all of this additional information to it, but it is, when you boil it down, it's a very simple recipe sometimes, and people, I think, want to make this monster out of a molehill, and it's like, no, it really is that simple, but you almost don't want to insult the person by telling them it's that simple, because they're struggling to grasp it. And I picked up on you saying that whitetail hunting may be simple if you choose to make it that way.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of deer hunters that overcomplicate it. They make it way more difficult than it really is. And there's some basic rules that you got to follow. And I think what happens is a lot of times deer hunters don't follow those basic rules. And, one of them is learning to play the wind. There's no getting around it. You either learn to play the wind when you hunt these big bucks, or you're not going to be successful. And there's nothing you can buy that's going to help you. Sure, there's products that are, made to control your odor, but do you realize how a mature buck's using the wind? Even if you was 100% scent free, that mature buck is maybe not going to come past your stand, or probably not going to come past your stand if the conditions are not right for him to do so safely. He's got to feel safe or he's not doing it. And it is really simple, but there's some basic things that you absolutely have to nail, or everything else doesn't really matter.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense, and we'll make some more comparisons down the road. I got some questions for you on scent and giving them the wind a little bit. But like every Cutting the Distance podcast, we're going to field a few questions from our listeners, and if you want to submit a question of your own, you can email us at ctd@phelpsgamecalls.com. So the first question we got: I'm trying to get a count of deer on my property. When and how should the census be taken? And I'm going to add something on that they didn't. I'm assuming it's going to be a little dependent on region and kind of where you're at during the cycle. But what's your answer to when should people be looking to try to get a good count, on bucks and does on their property?
Well, to be honest, that's something that I don't deal with a whole lot. And the reason for it is most of the landowners that I'm consulting with have smaller acreage, and by smaller I mean under 1,000 acres. Some of them under 100 acres, but definitely under 1,000 acres for the most part. Now, I've done a couple bigger properties, and when you're talking about a property of 200 or 300 or 400 acres, it doesn't matter what you do on that property to try to influence the local herd. If your neighbors aren't on board, it's not going to work. And you could, if you've got an overpopulation of deer, for example, you can shoot 25 does on your farm, and if your neighbors aren't helping you out, 30 more are going to come from their farm and replace the 25 you just shot, and you're gaining nothing. So, and most of the time it almost takes the state game agencies to set the regulations as far as herd management or herd control. And the individual landowner really doesn't have a whole lot he can do, and for that reason, that's something that I just don't address with my clients. Now, if I was like on some of the bigger ranches, say down in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and that part of the world, it would be a totally different story. But those just aren't my clients, and that's not my niche, if you will.
Okay, that makes a ton of sense. The second question: when bow hunting from an elevated stand, where do you like to aim at a deer? Does this change on the feedback you're getting from the buck? Head down, looking your direction, ears back, any of those things. But where are you aiming from an elevated stand?
Well, first of all, shot selection is absolutely critical. I will only take a broadside or slightly quartered away shot. And when I do that, I'm aiming for the offside shoulder. So not the shoulder closest to me, but the far side shoulder. I want my arrow to, and I only hunt with a bow, so I'm only talking about bow hunting. I want my arrow to hit both lungs, and that's what I'm shooting for, is a double lung hit. I'm aiming. It depends on how close the deer is and how high I am, but typically I want that arrow about 1/3 of the way up that deer's body, and right behind the shoulder if he's totally broadside. Now, if he's quartered away, then I want it back a little farther, and I'm aiming for that off shoulder. But the double lung shot is the only shot that I think is ethical.
So with that said, are you coming from out west? A lot of our elk, our mule deer don't tend to jump. I say there's always the exception, but for the most part, they don't jump the string like we've seen whitetail. Growing up on watching all TV show, things duck 8-10 inches. So you're not aiming any lower than a vital shot. So you're still aiming at that bottom third to make, or do you account for some sort of duck? No,
I don't. I'm aiming for that bottom third, but I also am not a proponent of long shots. To be honest, it's almost, I can't even remember the last time I shot over 30 yards, and most of my shots are 20 and under. The 15 to 20 yard range is where I'm shooting. So, I'm aiming at that lower third of the body, and I'm getting a good hit and pass through and clean kills, almost every time. So, shot selection is the key.
Yep. Yeah. I was fortunate enough to shoot my deer at 8 yards, and by that time, whether they heard it or not, they don't have near the time to move, and your arrow is going to hit right where you intended it to. So perfect. Thanks for answering those. Once again, if you have any questions for us here or my guests at Cutting the Distance, please email us or message us at ctd@phelpsgamecalls.com. So on today's episode, I want to dive into hunting whitetail bucks, and maybe more specifically what it takes to grow and hunt the next level bucks, as well as making sure you have mature bucks kind of in the pipeline coming up. I feel like a lot of Western hunting translates to whitetails. In its simplest form, hunting is always going to be broken down into things I can control, things I have an effect on, and then things that are out of my control. And within those, I tend to focus on things we can control, and then what I'm hoping to get from Don today is dive into some of those things where through decision making we can at least predict or at least limit the variables of those things out of our control when it comes to whitetail hunting. And that's, I'm very, Don, I've got an engineering background. I break things down into like its simplest form and then start to categorize. So as an engineer, I want things, in their coffers, like I want it to make sense. And so that's everything out west. It's like, all right, I can control this. I can have an effect on this, and then there's some things that are out of my control as far as where they're going to be. But by putting myself in a place where we're trying to limit those variables that are out of our control. As we talked earlier, I'm someone that's new to the whitetail game, and then it's a little daunting. As I got home from this past time, I jump on the internet, I'm watching YouTube, I'm reading articles, and it's very, very tough to try to figure out what information is good and proven, and then what may have very good supporting arguments, but may not work or actually make your hunting area or your hunting property worse. And so one of the reasons I was drawn and really wanted to bring you on the podcast is you weren't afraid to say, that some ideas could be bad, and I really like that. I'm the same way. I'm not afraid to say that I think that's a bad idea and you shouldn't do that when it comes to hunting tactics and techniques. And I want to know, through all of your experiences, you mentioned earlier, 42 years, I want to know if something, how many times something worked out of 100. And guess what? Even better, if you've seen or did something 1,000 times, how many times did it work in your favor? How many times didn't? So you can start to put a plan together. So I'm going to pick your brain a little bit. I've got a series of questions and we'll just kind of walk through them. And see what you have to say.
Okay.
So Pretty cliche, pretty obvious statement here, but we all know when it comes to hunting, we can only kill what we can see. And this may be one of the biggest crux, it seems like, as a whitetail hunter. I'm starting to learn very quickly the properties we were hunting had big deer on cameras at night, and we were having a heck of a time finding them during the day because they didn't seem to be moving. Maybe we were missing them. But is there a best management practice to make sure you're seeing the majority of your mature deer in the daylight? Can you affect that, or is that something that's naturally inherent and just kind of built into a deer? Or can you design your property to help out in that situation for seeing mature bucks in the daylight?
Well, I mean, that's a great question, and I address it with every single client that I meet with, and you've got to hunt mature deer on the property they spend their daylight hours on. And that means you've got to hunt them where they bed. So when I meet with a client, the first thing I'm doing when I'm looking at his property is I'm figuring out what do we got to do to get the local bucks to bed on this property. And most deer hunters, I mean, the vast majority of deer hunters put way too much pressure on their property. The bucks they're trying to kill, they bump them off and they don't have a chance. And I tell my clients all the time, if you are one property over from where a deer beds, so if he's bedding right across the line on the neighbor, your odds of killing that deer are 10% what they are if you're on the same property. So, right out of the gate, you got to be hunting them on the properties where they bed.
Okay, now, you're a big proponent of providing a sanctuary. What if the bedding is that sanctuary? Do you consider the bedding the sanctuary? And if so, how much pressure will you be willing to put on that bedding area, or getting as close to the bedding and maybe away from their feed as possible so that you can catch them in the daylight?
Yeah, I'm a huge proponent of sanctuaries. In fact, I've said many times, if I had a 500-acre property, 450 of it would be a sanctuary I would never go into. 50 of it would be food plots, and I'd hunt the edge. So,
yeah.
I never go into the bedding cover of the sanctuary per se, but I'm always hunting on the edge of it, and it's always the downwind edge. So my scent is blowing out of that sanctuary, and I'm on that downwind side, and it's just the perfect place to be when those bucks are cruising. If they feel comfortable, they think that sanctuary is a safe zone. They've never encountered humans there. They're going to be on their feet a lot more daylight hours, and when they are, they want to be on that downwind edge because then they can smell all that cover. They can detect, a hot doe or danger as well. So it works perfect. I've killed numerous bucks this way, but having an undisturbed sanctuary on your property and hunting it properly on the downwind edge at all times is absolutely key to a lot of my success.
So another way to pose this question, if you were to look at a piece of property and figure out where the deer like to bed, is it a good strategy to try to put some food plots within close proximity to it? As you've mentioned, not disturb their bedding, their sanctuary, but is getting that food or even minor food sources, your smaller plots, is that a good strategy to get those deer on their feet and maybe catch them before they're, on their way to big ag later in the night, or something like it? Would just getting, that food a little closer to bed kind of assist in daylight,
Well, as long as that food is not within the bedding cover. If it's out on the edge, yeah, that's a great strategy. I've seen, I don't know how many consultants or whitetail habitat so-called experts claim, for example, when you plant switchgrass that you should have clover and forbs and things in there for the deer to eat. You don't want just a monoculture of switchgrass. You want some food in there for them too. Well, I totally disagree with that. If a buck on my property wants to eat, I don't want him to just stand up in his bed and drop his head and start feeding. I want to force that deer to have to move from his bed to his food, and that movement is what makes him killable. That's the pattern we're hunting. If he doesn't have to move, well, he's way harder to kill.
Yeah, and that makes a ton of sense. Why would you want that deer to get up out of his bed, eat there without having to come where he's shootable? Because you're not going to be able to set a stand or a very effective stand necessarily in that switchgrass, or you want that to be their security, their sanctuary, somewhere where they feel safe. And it just seems common sense says don't let them eat in there, just let them bed in there. or
Right.
use it for security.
Well, it's common sense to you and I, but I don't think it is to some people.
Yeah, I mean that it's one of the things we use. We don't like to hunt elk necessarily in the center of their food. We don't like to hunt elk in their bedding area. We will at times go into their bedding area, especially late in the hunt when we're running out of time and we're on public ground. It's not we don't got the whole. It's not a chunk of private, so we will go in there. But a lot of times we're trying to do the same thing. Is whether people want to draw similarities or not. We're really trying to hunt them closer to their food in the morning, and then we're trying to hunt them a little closer to their bed in the evening, and we're doing something real similar. One last question on getting deer in daylight. Is it your opinion, and I've tracked this, I've seen you answer this before, maybe that deer, maybe the best pattern you can put on a deer is what they did the year before. If you've got good indicators on that deer, as far as and some of the talk, the examples that you've shared and other people have shared, is it's almost to the day, where that deer will start to show up on a property, or that deer will start to show in the daylight. Is that some of the most valuable information you use when if that deer is showing similar patterns from year to year, that you're going to will you base a hunt on that similar pattern?
Absolutely. I was the first one to write about this back in 2003. I wrote an article for North American Whitetail magazine titled Same Time, Same Place. And to that point, I'd never heard anybody talk about it. Now it's pretty well accepted today. A lot of people have wrote about it, talked about it, made videos about it. But there is an uncanny pattern among mature bucks to show up at the same time at the same place year after year. And I'm talking down to within about a 24, 48 hour period. So, a lot of times these whitetail bucks will spend their summers in bachelor groups in one location. And then, as fall draws near and they start shedding their velvet and the testosterone levels start rising, those bachelor groups will break up and those bucks will shift to their fall range, and they will move sometimes, miles. And what I've found is when those bucks shift to that fall range, it's almost to the day, year after year, to the day, they'll show up on a property where they haven't been all summer. There was a buck that I shot in when was it, 2015. It's a buck that I had watched grow up for 6 years, and I watched him since he was a year and a half old. As a year and a half old buck, he had 6 points on each side, just a little tiny 12-point rack. But I kept track of him, and I thought he might have a chance to hit 200, and I just kept walking away from the opportunity to hunt him. And during that 6 years that I watched him grow up, I hit on a pattern that this buck was showing up on this one property I had permission to hunt. About the first time he would show up for the entire year, the first date he would show up would be about November 6th. And the last day he would be there would be about November 20th. And what he was doing was there was a lot of does bedding on that property, and this buck was showing up to, find a hot doe, checking that doe group out. And, I had him down to a T. And so the year I decided to kill him, when he was 6.5 years old, I had my stands ready, and I knew, don't even go in there and hunt. Don't put any pressure on that property till November 6th. Well, November 6th rolls around. I had 2 stands on that property, and I needed very specific winds to hunt those stands. November 6th rolls around, the wind's wrong, I can't hunt. November 7th, the wind's wrong, I can't hunt. November 8th, finally the wind was right. I go in there, the first morning that I ever hunted for that deer, I killed him. And 9 o'clock on that first morning, 6 years I watched that buck and then kill him on the very first hunt. Same time, same place. I knew when he was going to be there. That trail camera history is so important when I'm chasing these big deer. Trail cameras have almost made it easy.
Yeah, it's nice to have those trail cameras to build those patterns and really put the variables or the unknowns or the things working against you. At least you can get a solid plan on those, and then let the wind, like you said, the wind was the variable on that one. You just had to wait for the right wind, and then that was the only one you were really having to play. So, makes a ton of sense. So my next question, there's a lot of information about creating bedding areas and figuring out where the does like to bed, and the bucks need to bed behind them according to food. And you've been, I hope not I hope I don't misquote you here, but you've said to allow them to bed where they want, and don't put the pressure on them. No need to go in there and make bedding. They're going to be there. With that said, if you're building a property and say you don't have the timber or you do have the timber, what would you say the preferred bedding is? If you were going to go in and work over a property, are you trying to create timber bedding? Are you trying to create CRP, bedding? Are they always going to bed behind the does? Can you give us a little bit on if you're going to build perfect beds, are you going to go in a hinge cut? Where do big mature bucks like to hang out and feel secure?
It boils down to one thing: freedom of human intrusion. They would rather bed in a wide open woods with no cover whatsoever if there's no human activity in there than they would to bed in the thickest, nastiest place they could find if it's overrun with human pressure. I totally disagree, and I got all kinds of firsthand experience to back it up. This idea that the bucks are going to bed here and the does are going to bed in front of them and all this nonsense, it's total garbage. It doesn't work that way. People try to make it way more complicated than it really is. It boils down to freedom of human intrusion. Now, you asked about the type of cover. Well, I look at bedding cover on a property that I'm managing or I'm developing a plan for the same way I do the food sources. Diversity. I want as many different food sources on a property as I can get. And I want as many different kinds of bedding cover also. I want diversity. I want some switchgrass. I want some, thick second growth. I want some mature timber with a really thick understory. I just want diversity. And the reason for that is I've noticed on my own farm that there are certain individual bucks that will prefer different types of bedding cover. For example, I've got bucks, and I've had mature bucks on my farm that they preferred to bed in the switchgrass. And day after day after day, you could just about count on those deer in the afternoon, evening, coming out of the switchgrass. That's where they would bed day after day. And other mature bucks, they always wanted to bed in the wooded cover. So I think diversity is key. And if you think of it from a land management standpoint, talk about diversity. Let's say you're the only guy in the neighborhood who has a big switchgrass patch on your farm. And one of those bucks comes along that likes to bed in the switchgrass. Well, guess what? He's bedding on your place day after day after day. That's why diversity is so important, so that you can kind of, curtail your farm or design your farm for every buck. You're not just trying to accommodate those bucks that like the switchgrass. You're also trying to accommodate the ones that like the wooded cover. So diversity is key, but it really boils down to human intrusion or freedom of human intrusion. That's what a mature buck demands. He's not going to put up with it.
I'm going to talk a little bit later about the sanctuary, but I have to ask the question just why you talked about human presence, and I think, if people go back and watch your material, you probably said it 1,000 times, if not more, which, I've always said you hear something more than 3 times, it's important by the guy talking about it. And so, obviously sanctuary is very, very important, but to when you say no human intrusion, is that 0? Is that checking your trail cameras 3 times? Is that you can ride your a 4-wheeler trail along the edge of it a couple times a year? Like, the definition of, no human intrusion, or is it just one of those things where the more the better? Or does it have to be, I guess another way to phrase this is, what will a big buck let you get away with?
Well, they're all individuals, and one will let you get away with a lot and the other one nothing. And a good example of that's trail cameras. One buck, he'll walk in front of a trail camera and he'll pose day after day after day, and you get dozens of pictures of him. Another buck, you get his picture one time on a trail camera and boom, he's gone. He's not coming past that camera ever again. With bedding cover or a sanctuary, when I say 0, I mean 0. I mean, I don't have trail cameras inside the sanctuary. I don't have paths for 4-wheelers or anything in the sanctuary. The closest I get to the sanctuary is hunting the edge of it. Now, as far as going into it, there's only 3 times I'll go into it. One is to do habitat work in the off season. Once the season's closed in the winter, before spring green up, I will sometimes go in if I need to thicken things up. I'll go with the chainsaw, whatever I need to do to maintain good habitat. The other times, if I shoot a deer and he runs in the sanctuary, well, obviously I'm going to go get him to retrieve a deer. And the third time is one day every spring. And one day I go into my sanctuary to look for shed antlers. And when I go, I usually take my grandsons and son-in-law and daughter. They go along. Sometimes a couple friends will go along. And we do the shed antler hunt one time. We don't drag it out. We don't go back 3 or 4 times. It's like one day we go in, we cover it all, we get out, and we stay out. But from the time that things green up in spring, say around April 1st or so, through the entire summer and through the entire hunting season, nobody's in the sanctuary. Nobody for anything.
Okay, that clears it up. So sanctuary is absolutely, as close to zero as possible with 3 exceptions. Yeah, so no human presence. All right. You've been quoted many times. You said it earlier in this one. On the November 6th buck when we're trying to put together patterns. You typically only need 2 to 3 days to go in and kill your target buck. With that said, do you have a preferred time to be in the stand? Would you rather go in pre-rut, in the lockdown phase, post-rut, or are you looking for weather or something else determining when you're going to be in that stand? Cold fronts, rut, some people have said they're more patternable in the pre-rut. Like, when do you like to be in the stand when you get the right conditions?
Well, the rut is absolutely my least favorite time to hunt. In the rut, if you kill a giant in the rut, there is more luck involved than anything. And I want to kill them on purpose. I guess I'm not that lucky, so I've got to work and put the odds in my favor. And, I'm fine with pre-rut. That's a great time. Early season, right out of the gate, if you've got those bucks coming to a food source and they're undisturbed, that's a great time to kill a giant. The end of October when they're starting to hit scrapes, that's a good time. But, after about, say the 5th or so of November, they become pretty tough. Now, I say that my favorite day, if I had to pick a favorite day of the entire season, it would be November 7th, simply because those bucks are on their feet so much. The does aren't quite in heat yet, and those bucks are covering a lot of territory looking for them. But to be honest, if I had to pick the best time to kill a mature buck on purpose, one particular buck that you've got your eye on, to kill him on purpose, the best time to do it is in the late season during a brutal cold spell and on an afternoon hunt, because in those conditions, there's no such thing as a nocturnal buck. When it gets down to 0, those bucks got to feed to stay alive. And every afternoon, an hour before dark, they're on their feet and they're headed to the food, or they're in the food by that time. That is the best time to catch a mature buck on his feet, because I'm not talking about one buck. I'm talking every buck in the area during those conditions are on their feet feeding.
Yeah, and we noticed that this year on that whitetail hunt. We had good intentions of being there from October 25th to November 5th. I drew a big bull tag, and schedules got mixed around, and we couldn't get out there till November 10th, and we hunted till, we'd planned November 10th to the 20th. And it was an awesome time to be in the woods, not such an awesome time to figure out where all the deer had been that had been on cameras the entire time. And then when we did see a big buck, a lot of times he was running, 120 yards away, and you had no control over getting him to go on the path he had been going for the, 3 months ahead of that. So we learned really quick that, lockdown stage, whatever people want to call it, the peak rut, it was just like, he doesn't respond to a call. He doesn't look this way. He doesn't respond to rattling. There's nothing you can do to get him off that doe. And so you became an observer of the whitetail at that point, not a hunter of them. It seemed like at times. Where the week before they had great success, the bucks that they knew were there, they had on cameras coming to certain areas. They get a little bit of that pre-rut, bucks on their feet a little more, starting to cruise a little more, get a little more confident, and they seem to do really well those 10 days before we had got there. So they all seem to be on board with that as well. Moving on to weather, it includes all kinds of variables. We've got, when people talk about weather, what's the temperature going to be? What's the precip? Are we getting rain or snow based on the temperature? Barometric pressure rising, dropping, the wind, and so on. And then to complicate all of that, you've got how those factors change within a set amount of time. So, the temperature is 32, but it's dropping from 60 is important versus, the temperature is, 32 dropping from 34. It's not as big a swing. So you have these factors, but then you also have how those factors are changing with a set amount of time. So all of those factors, I've heard you say it multiple times, weather affects your decision, but what weather are you looking for? What are you looking for as far as temperature, precip, barometric pressure, wind, all of those things? I know the answers, but I'm kind of, I know what your answer is, but if you can kind of lead into what you're looking for, from an ideal weather standpoint.
Well, I want a cold front. I want that cold front. For example, last year we had a cold front that the temperature had been 20 degrees above normal. And then the cold front come through and it just dropped those temperatures to about normal. Well, that ain't much of a cold front. I want that cold front to come through and drop the temperatures below normal for that time of year by at least 10 degrees or more. And that will really affect deer movement. I want the barometer to be rising. If you can get over 30, that's fantastic. At the same time that weather's coming through. I like those fronts that come with east winds. For some reason, I've just had phenomenal success hunting east winds. Those east winds almost always accompany a weather front. They don't just happen. So, I've had success on the front end and the back end of the front. They're all just a little bit different, but it needs to drop the temperature at least 10 degrees below what would be considered normal for that time of the year in that area.
Okay, so you don't necessarily care about a 20-degree temperature swing if it's only getting you back to normal. You're looking for a temperature swing that gets you below normal, and then at that point it could be maybe a 10, 15-degree temperature switch, but at least it's getting colder than normal. It's not just... Now, would you look at something, the example you gave, where you are getting a change in temperature? Does that not necessarily equate to good hunting? It's gonna obviously be better than maybe what you had during the warm spell, but it's not going to be that exceptional switch.
Right. Yeah, if the temperature drops 20 degrees and it had been 20 degrees above normal and it drops you down to normal, well, the deer activity is definitely going to be better than it had been. But it's still not going to be what it could be if it was normal and then dropped 10 degrees. I would rather hunt that cold front.
Yeah. The rain or snow affect your decision to be in a tree? Positively or negatively?
Heavy rain will keep me out, and it's more about the blood trail than anything. I don't want to take a chance on losing a deer, and if it's heavy rain, well, who likes to sit out there and get soaked anyway? But I don't mind a really light rain. I really like when it's one of those overcast November days and you get some sleet, just a little bit of sleet. That first kind of really winter cold front moves through, and I just love that kind of condition.
Yeah, I think that's maybe precipitation might be the one factor on why I don't like hunting blacktails out here anymore, because my dad doesn't even get excited until the wind's 40 miles an hour straight sideways and you can't hold your eyes open, and that's the time our blacktails move, and it's like, yeah, I'm with you. I don't necessarily want to be out there getting soaked while I'm hunting. Now if it's good, I'd be out there, but similar to what you said, your blood trails, you always got to worry about that. And no matter how good a shot, you may be at risk of not finding them. So, and then wind.
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, this season, we had some really windy days, and I run a series of cameras. I've got about 50 trail cameras, and a dozen of those are cell cameras. So I know without a doubt, with that many cameras on different properties, when the deer are moving or they're not moving, I know it, because when they're moving, my phone's lighting up with those cell cameras going off. And when they're not moving, my phone is dead. And the interesting thing this year is I really paid close attention, and on the days that was dead calm, the deer activity was dead as well. And I came to the conclusion, and I just came to it this season. I'm always learning, just like everybody else. I don't know it all and always trying to get better, but I just figured out this season that on those windy days, that's a great time to hunt. Just like you were saying, your dad likes to hunt when it's 40 mile an hour. I'll tell you what, my cameras were lighting up when the wind was 30 miles an hour, And the dead calm days, the cameras were dead.
Huh. Yeah, that's. I know where we hunted, in Kansas, they don't like being out at all if there's no wind. It's like the deer movement almost, goes down to nothing on those days, at least from their experience. At least, where their stands are at. Maybe they're moving somewhere else, but not where they want them to be when there's no wind. They expect to have wind. They use that for for their safety, and if there's no wind, they're just going to sit still a little longer.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I had that point driven home this season.
We've all seen plenty of gadgets and fads come and go, but here's one product that stood the test of time: Seafoam Motor Treatment. Lots of hunters and anglers know that Seafoam helps engines run better and last longer. It's really simple. When you pour it in your gas tank, Seafoam cleans harmful fuel deposits that cause engine problems. I'm talking common stuff like hard starts, rough engine performance, or lost fuel economy. Seafoam is an easy way to prevent or overcome these problems. Just pour a can in your gas tank and let it clean your fuel system. You probably know someone who has used a can of Seafoam to get their truck or boat going again. People everywhere rely on Seafoam to keep their trucks, boats, and small engines running the way that they should the entire season. Help your engine run better and last longer. Pick up a can of Seafoam today at your local auto parts store or visit seafoamworks.com to learn more.
There's nothing like snook hook sets at dawn or catching a tarpon in the moonlight. Find your next fishing trip made easy on fishingbooker.com and experience the magic of the Sunshine State or any other destination on your fishing bucket list. Book a blue water adventure in search of sailfish or go snapper fishing with the kids. With over 6,000 captains and trips to choose from, planning your next one just got a whole lot easier. Download the Fishing Booker app on the Google Play or App Store or visit them online at fishingbooker.com to book your trip today.
What's your opinion on the second rut? I know what it is, but then do you believe that those younger fawns, yearlings, will rut later, and so it's just one long continuous rut, or do you not believe in any of that? And the rut, it happens in middle of November.
Well, I think outdoor riders, me being one, have kind of. We're always looking to coin terms to, sell articles and gain attention. At least that was the way it was before the internet became so prominent. And I think today these guys that have blogs or videos on online YouTube channels, they're always looking for terms they can coin, like the doe factory, for example. The second rut was coined by outdoor riders, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago. And I think that people just don't understand how the rut actually plays out. And it plays out the same every year. You've got, if you think of those does coming into heat in a bell-shaped curve, you got that period where it peaks, where there's the most of them in heat. And then towards the end of November, it tapers off. Well, doe fawns are not going to come into heat, exactly 30 days after the mature does. It just don't happen like that. Doe fawns come into heat based on their body weight. When they get about 80 pounds, they're coming into heat. And in fact, the majority, in my opinion, the majority of doe fawns are bred in January. There's some bred in February and even later. But I think the majority of doe fawns that get bred their first year, now some of them don't get bred that first year because they never achieved the body size to bring them into sexual maturity and into heat. But the majority of doe fawns that come into heat and do get bred that first year are going to get bred in January. But it's not going to be like a certain week in January or anything like that. It's just going to be, here and there. And when it happens, the bucks are on top of it. They're going to take advantage of it. But that's nothing that you can mark on the calendar. The other thing that the whole second rut idea, a false part of that theory, if you will, is they promote the idea that during that peak breeding season, some does don't get bred on their first estrus cycle. Well, I believe that the number of does that don't get bred on their first estrus cycle is so minuscule. I mean, it's probably not 1 in 1,000 does. Every buck in the woods is capable of breeding a doe, including a lot of button bucks. If a doe comes in heat, she's going to have the attention of bucks, and she's going to get bred by at least 1, if not 10 different bucks. She's going to get bred if she comes into heat. Now, I think I had a research herd of captive whitetails for 25 years, so I got to see a lot of this stuff firsthand in a captive setting, where it was a lot easier to observe. And I think there's some individual does that are going to come in heat on about the same day every year. So if a doe comes in heat on November 14th this year, next year she's probably coming in heat on the 14th, if not the 13th or the 15th. Within 24 hours, she's coming into heat the same time. And the idea that they're not getting bred is just, I think it's just total garbage.
Gotcha. No, that makes a ton of sense. And you've got the experience and the observation to support that. So a few things. I don't want to dwell on these ones for too long. There's some of these factors that I've heard you talk about before. How would you use mock scrapes and water? You can answer these separately, but how would you use mock scrapes to potentially plan a hunt around, or water, or would you use them at all to plan your hunt around? And would you rather go, back to the idea of being on their path from bedding to food?
Well, I would never use either to plan my hunt, but I do use mock scrapes to inventory bucks on a property. I can put that mock scrape wherever I want. I can put it in a place where I can easily check my trail camera and not disturb the property. So I can create a mock scrape anywhere, and I don't care that the buck checks it at night. That doesn't bother me whatsoever. I just want to know what bucks are on that property. And if they're there, if there's a shooter buck there, I can figure out where to kill him. I don't need to bring him into a mock scrape to do that. That's how I use them for inventory purposes. Water, I think water in much of the country is overrated. I don't think that water is the factor that's going to change a lot of properties and take an average property and make it really good. Now, there's some situations, especially when you get out in the plain states. You talk about Kansas, that could be a different story out there. Water could be critical. But you get into the Midwest, I just don't see it as being an issue whatsoever. There's just way too many water sources, creeks and ponds and whatever here and there. Now, with that said, you can build a water hole, and the deer are absolutely going to use it. No doubt about it. And if you put it in the right spot where you can put a stand nearby that has good access that you can hunt the wind with, well, yeah, it can have a positive influence on your hunting success. But I think, water sources, artificial man-made water sources, have been way overstated, or their importance way overstated in the whitetail management community.
I have a real dumb question, which I don't want to assume the answer, so I'm going to ask it. Out west, we always say elk have to go find water. They have to find standing water somewhere. They need to go to a pond, creek, lake, whatever it is. Now, mule deer, it's been well known that they can pull moisture either out of their food they're eating or out of the precipitation recovery at night. It cools down, water condenses out of the soil, out of the plants, and there's water available. Can whitetail, in your opinion, do they have to, you'd mentioned it, do they have to go to water, or can they get it through food and lush greens and precip recovery as well?
Well, one of the reasons that I've got that opinion about water is an experience that I've had near my home. There's a place that every summer there's a bachelor group on this section of land. And from road to road to road, surrounded by roads on four sides, that section of land, there is not a water source anywhere on that. And I've been all over it. There's not a water source. It's mainly ag fields with some hedgerows and such. But every year, there is a bachelor group of bucks that stays on that section, and they're there day after day after day. And I've long wondered, where are these deer getting their water? And I've got to believe that a majority of that water has to be coming from the plants they're eating. And they're feeding heavily on soybeans that time of year. And the moisture content in those green soybean leaves has got to be high. I never dreamed it was high enough that they would not need to drink, but apparently it is. And that experience, and these bucks have been using this same place this summer for decades now. And every year there's a bachelor group there, but there's no water. And that's kind of driven my idea that water is way overrated here in the Midwest.
Yeah, I like I say, I would think if a mule deer could make it without ever going to a water source, whitetail should be able to do the same, but I just didn't know that one. So, yeah, Thanks for that. Next one, wind. Out west, it's all we think about. We go through 10 puffer bottles of wind in a season. Not really. 2 or 3 bottles. We're always checking the wind. It's very, very important. And one of my strategies is because why I do like a frontal shot on bull elk. One of the things we've always talked about is giving them a little bit of the wind, and I'm willing to give them 45 degrees to 90 degrees of the wind, because what that does is somebody calling to the elk. Those elk are similar to deer. They're going to get to 60, 70 yards and try to circle us and get wind. Well, if I give them 90 degrees of wind, when they go to circle, it's going to pull them broadside in front of me. Or if we have a caller and a shooter. So we've heard whitetail hunters talk about giving them the wind a little bit. And like I said, I don't want to misquote you, but some of those mature bucks, they're mature for a reason. They're smart. They're not going to play the wind perfect. You have a direct north wind. They're not going to be dumb, and they're not going to walk necessarily perfectly in a spot where they can get killed without putting any thought into it. Now they may, but that's the anomaly, and we're trying to, like you said, you're trying to kill a deer on purpose, not because he just for some reason walked directly, with no regard to the wind. Can you give us a little bit of insight on how much you're willing to risk the wind? And when you say give them the wind, are you taking as big a risks as your wind maybe crossing the trail you expect him to be on, but you'll shoot him before he gets there? Or are you talking, 90 degrees, 180 degrees, kind of explain what giving him the wind to maybe fool that bigger buck or beat him in that chess match?
Well, when I was probably about 19, 20 years old, I met a whitetail legend, Roger Rothar. Any whitetail hunter that's 50 years old or older should remember Roger Rothar, an absolute legend. And he told me, I'll never forget it, he told me the wind needs to be almost right for the buck and almost wrong for you, and that key word being almost. So if he's walking down that trail, he doesn't even necessarily want that wind straight in his face, but he wants it quartering in his nose. And if it's quartering into his nose from either direction, then you can be off to one side of that trail, and he's still got a good wind for him to move, but you're off on the right side of the trail. Your scent is blowing not straight down the trail, but kind of down the trail, but off to the side. And that's the situation that I'm always trying to set up. I think too many deer hunters, a mistake they make is they're trying to get a buck to commit suicide. They're trying to get him to give up the wind. And a mature buck is just not going to do that most of the time. Now, occasionally they're going to do about anything, but if you want to kill them consistently, you've got to give them the wind. And that doesn't mean entirely, but you got to give it to them enough that they think that they're safe and they're going to get up and walk in daylight hours with the wind that you're giving them.
Okay, yeah, we were in a few stands where we thought we had it perfect. Great wind when you look at an aerial. Great wind everywhere we think they're bedding, everywhere we think they're going to go rut is perfect. We were just inside of a fence line, 15, 20 yards is where we were in a blind that day. We weren't in a tree stand. It didn't matter. The wind was perfect. But what we noticed is these bigger bucks, we would hear something blow behind the stand, or a doe, or we'd hear something kind of jet, and we'd peek out one of the corners. Everything's kind of screwed up. And he realized that he could walk down the fence line that was 20 yards behind us and wind check that entire patch of timber and we were inside of it, and we're like, dang it, but there was nowhere to set up because we had nothing but a wide open pasture behind us. But it got you thinking, like, these bigger, and that happened to 2 or 3 of the biggest bucks that walked by that, some of the shooters that we were wanting to target. Of course we had all kinds of, 3.5, 4.5-year-old bucks in front of us, but the 2 older bucks, they wind checked that out in the wide open field where, maybe they wouldn't feel safe, but it was actually safer to be there than inside, where they could see. And it was kind of funny that we were playing the wind perfect for all the deer in our shooting lane, but yet those deer still, outsmarted us. So you almost needed to move back, or, if the blind would have been moved back and turned, you could have maybe seen them coming down the fence line and had a shot with, you were only giving them 90 degrees of wind, but that wind would have been better for killing them versus not having a chance to see them. So it kind of got my wheels spinning of, it's like, yeah, you might need to give these things, a little bit of wind, and who knows if it happens like that every time, but it in my opinion, 2 times was consistent enough to get you thinking that deer was outsmarting us and wind checking the whole entire patch of timber.
Well, mature bucks are absolutely going to do it just about every time. We can go right back to the beginning of this podcast, and I said hunt the downwind edge of bedding cover. Those bucks are going to be on that downwind edge doing exactly what you just described. And when I'm hunting the edge, I'm hunting the very edge, and sometimes those bucks are even downwind of me. Now, I've got my tree stand and the scent's blowing this way, and that buck, he's walking by, but my scent's going right over the top of his back. He's actually downwind. It just, he's close enough that, and the wind's velocity is high enough that my scent just carries right over his back. I've shot a lot of bucks that way.
Yeah, and I got, like I say, I'm new. I'm getting educated. We spent, after the hunt, we walked the property in some spots on how we could maybe hunt that better, and that was one of the keys. We looked at, where to set a tree stand so that we could intercept the deer going down the fence, still have good cover. It was kind of on a high point, so they felt, like no matter which direction the wind blew, we were going to be able to blow over the top of, the cedar thicket kind of came out behind us, which we thought they were running, and they were running a lot of does in there. And so, really quickly, like, you could set up there. It's going to give them the wind, but they thought in the location that tree would be, nothing would really smell us, or at least no area that was important would ever get our wind. And we could basically hunt 360 around that stand. So, it was kind of interesting where I was kind of scratching my head, like, why the heck would you put a stand here? But they were confident enough. You were high enough, nothing, everything was dropping off. You'd be safe there and be able to shoot. So it was, interesting to give them the wind a little bit. And then, I suspect next time I go back and hunt that place, we're going to have a stand there and be able to capitalize on, that route that multiple big bucks were taking to check a big timber patch.
It's all about the wind. Those big bucks are not going to give it up very often. If you're going to kill them consistently, you got to play the wind.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. And just what I on my one trip, it kind of clicked. That whole idea of giving them a little bit, if not a lot of it. What does your scent control regimen look like? Being a Western, I keep going back to this, being a Western guy, like we've kind of given up on scent control. We, I used to spray my boots and wear elk estrus wafers on my hat early days. And then it's like, well, I've always got to breathe. I'm always sweating as I'm walking around in the mountains. Like what I do in the washing machine and the dryer and throw them in a tub like the night before has no impact, because within 20 minutes of me riding my bike or hiking up a mountain and, breathing out of my mouth or whatnot, like I've given that up. Now, going whitetail hunting, I got busted a couple of days. I'm like, man, they shouldn't have got me. So, so you throw your clothes back in there, scent, put the scent killers all over it, whatnot. I'm curious, what does your scent control, look like, and how much does it matter? Or are you like us out west, and if the wind's right, it doesn't matter?
That's exactly right. At one time I did everything you could possibly do in regards to scent control. I even took the little chlorophyll tablets, to control your body odor. I do use the sprays. I even carried a bottle to pee in my tree stand. And I was still getting busted. I was going to all this trouble and I was still getting busted. Today I do absolutely nothing at all except play the wind. My clothes are laying in my garage right next to my truck. They're not even sealed up in a tote or nothing. They're laying there. If you've got the wind, you've got the wind. He ain't going to smell you. If you don't, he's going to smell you. And I've given a lot of seminars, and I get this question a lot. Somebody will ask, "What do you do for scent control?" And I'll turn it right around on the crowd, and I'll say, "Well, let me ask all you a question. How many of you use some sort of scent control product? You use the clothing or the sprays or whatever. If you use anything at all for scent control, raise your hand." Every hand goes up. I said, "How many of you have been winded by deer?" Every hand's still up in the air. It don't work. Now, it may work to some degree. It may control your odor to some degree, but you're onto it, man. Just forget that stuff and play the wind, and you either got it or you don't.
Yeah, and similar to you, some of your whitetail management ideas, of some of the other guys you say actually hurts you. I feel scent control can hurt you because if there's any placebo effect where it's in your head and you think you can get away with something, you've now just maybe shortcutted a decision on a tree location, or you've shortcutted, because you've now got some, it's not that way. Like, put the extra effort in, take a different trail to your stand, whatever you got to do, just put in the extra effort, and then assume that that scent control is not going to work, and you'll make better decisions. Be a little more conservative on your decisions.
I think that's a fantastic point. If you know the deer's going to smell you, they're going to, and they are, then you're going to hunt different. You're going to do whatever it takes to minimize those deer getting downwind where they can smell you. You're going to minimize or go out of your way to walk in such a place or in such a way that those deer are not very likely to catch your ground scent or encounter your ground scent. You're going to do that knowing they can smell you. But when you start using all these magic potions, well, then you get this false idea in your head that, hey, I'm scent free, I can do whatever, and walk through the woods and make all kinds of mistakes. And those products have probably saved more deer than they ever helped kill.
Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah. So I assume that. I was just kind of curious. I just get worried. It's like not having a ton of experience, not, having, thousands of deer walk by your stand like you, like what can you get away with? But I learned really quickly, like, man, if they're in that, I don't know, 120-degree fog behind you, like there's nothing you can do unless you're high enough and it's just blowing over them. But if, those molecules, or whether it's 10 molecules, 100, 1,000, I don't know how to quantify scent, but if they get enough of it, there's nothing you can do. You have to breathe. Your body's putting off heat all the time. In my opinion, you're just kind of, with my background being in deer calls and trying to, I've heard you talk about gimmicks and whatnot, but, we need, there is a way to use a deer's hearing against them, whether it's rattling, whether it's calls, whether it's grunting. What is your strategy when it comes to making noise from a stand? Are you silent? Is there a time where a snort, wheeze, a grunt, a bleat, or rattling may work? Or do you try to just be a fly on the wall the entire time and hope that the pattern of the deer works for you? Or is there a time where you will use a call here or there?
Well, I almost never call blindly. Now, if I see a target animal that's out of range and I don't think he's working towards me, I will definitely use a call. I do it a few times every year, but to be honest, I think, at least here in the Midwest, I think every one of those gadgets, gizmos, whatever, I think they get so overused by every deer hunter in the woods that by the time a buck gets mature, he knows the game. So, it's so hard to call them. I'm old enough that I remember the first grunt calls coming out. And the first season that I had a grunt call, I'm telling you what, just about every time I blew that thing, a buck came in. I mean, it sounded like a buck, and those bucks had never heard it before, and they came in. Today, you're lucky to call in 10%, and that's if you see him and he heard it because he pulls his head up and looks at you. You're lucky to get 10% of them to come into your stand. And that was not the case. And I think that if you're in places where there's not as much hunting pressure, then I think they're a lot more effective. The same thing can be said for decoys. I've had terrible experience with decoys, but I know guys in Kansas that swear by them. That they decoy in multiple bucks every single year. But I'm telling you, around here they don't work. You'll spook 20 deer for every single one that comes in to check your decoy out.
Yeah, that's funny. You mentioned that one point I want to make and see if it kind of correlates with what you've seen. This is Kansas, well managed pieces of property. The deer on these really probably only see my buddy Randy that owns the place, if anybody, and nobody hunts it. What I noticed, even with a well managed property, lots of bucks, different age classes. We were seeing 3.5, 4.5, 6.5, the whole gamut. Do you find, or what I found sitting in the tree, wanting to test the calls and use them, they were very, very effective on deer that were 4.5 and younger. Now, if I had a buck cruising that was 5.5 or 6.5 and he wasn't on lockdown, he was just doing the same, let's just say he's slowly trotting down a trail, same thing that these 3.5s or 4.5s were doing, and I hit him with the same sound, same volume, as much as I can do to be the same. That older buck, more mature buck might look in our direction, and he almost goes back to what he's doing, where I had a very, very high success rate on getting the 3.5s and the 4.5s to turn towards my tree. And so and that's my own observation. 10 days in a tree, I'm far from an expert, but there was enough of a pattern happening where it's like, oh, grunting in these younger bucks is real easy. These big ones just don't seem to want to play the game. Same thing with rattling. We had some bucks come charging, the blind or the tree that we were in, depending on the day. Older bucks very rarely, and that's not in lockdown. So yeah, just an observation I made, those 3.5, 4.5s, somewhat easy to call in, older deer, not so easy.
I agree with that 100%. Those older ones, I've heard it before, saying they probably circled downwind to some guy sitting in a tree blowing the Star Spangled Banner in his grunt tube,
Well, I really appreciate having you on here, Don. How can people find out more about you if they're interested in, reading any more of your material, subscribing to any of that, all of your platforms and whatnot?
Well, they can go to my website, which is higginsoutdoors.com, and my social media, Higgins Outdoors on Facebook and Instagram. I've got a YouTube channel, Chasing Giants with Higgins Outdoors, a podcast, Chasing Giants. It can be found on YouTube or any podcast platform. I'm out there. If you just do a search for my name, you're going to find me.
After digesting a lot of your information that you have to talk about outside of this podcast, and then even going through this podcast, I assume I know what the answer is going to be on this one. But in closing, if you have one tip that you feel would give whitetail hunters, better odds, in years to come on their own property, what would it be?
Freedom of human intrusion is the key. I mean, those big bucks are not going to tolerate human intrusion, and if you find a place where human intrusion is very limited or non-existent, there's a very good chance that's going to be the place you're going to find a mature buck. And you can, if you own your own farm, you can make it that way. And that's what I've done on my home farm. And I'm telling you, the biggest bucks in my neighborhood every single year are on my property.
Yeah, and I've heard the Joey buck. These sanctuaries don't have to be big. He was on like a 3-acre piece, right? And I've heard you reference, a single tree out in the middle of a field that's surrounded by some brush. Like that could be the sanctuary. You're just so when people go to look for these sanctuaries, you don't have to look at big, never-ending tracts of timber. It's just literally where nobody is bothering them. There's no it might be a corner of your neighbor's property. It might be a corner of your property you never go to, but that's where that buck wants to be. Absolutely. Well said. All right. Perfect. Well, thanks a lot, Don. Good luck if you get a chance to get back up in the stand, and always interested to learn from you. You got some great information out there, and like I say, I appreciate having you here on the podcast. Yeah, I'm willing to do it anytime, so thanks for having me, Jason. All right. Thanks, Don. Outdoor adventure won't wait for engine problems. Things like hard starts, rough performance, and lost fuel economy are often caused by fuel gum and varnish buildup. Seafoam can help your engine run better and last longer. Simply pour a can in your gas tank. Hunters and anglers rely on Seafoam to keep their engines running the way it should the entire season. Pick up a can of Seafoam today at your local auto parts store or visit seafoamworks.com to learn more.